of the folks that are kind of leading this conversation across the country. Even 3-4 years ago, when we had a chance to come to Christ Community, it was just marvelous to be able to hear the depth of the thinking that Tom's been working on over the years, how that practically gets worked out into a congregation, how it affects leadership and all that. And that is, of course, what we're trying to figure out how to do for our own congregation. So for Tom, one of the things I had asked him to do was help us sort of sketch out this whole economics thing, and how would you go about teaching that, from the pulpit? And so earlier this year, Tom had worked on a series of sermons precisely toward this point. And so I said, well, Tom, if we get some time in Kansas City, would you come and join us and just work through some of that with us? So Tom graciously agreed to that, and here he is. He's got his watch set out here, a clock back there, and I want him to know that means nothing.
Well, that's music to a teacher's ears. So I have to hit all these time parameters every Sunday morning. Like, if I'm 3 minutes over, it's like, you're dead, Children's ministry teams, like, you're dead. Don't do it to us. This is like joy.
Yeah, so
I won't abuse it, I promise.
So we'll get some time here. Give your attention to him. Would you welcome him and ask a few questions at the end? All the questions you want to ask. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you. Good morning. And it's a treat to be with the San Diego crew. We were talking a little earlier. My wife and I were in San Diego this January. I'm a part of the ON network. It's the Oikonomia network, which is a group of seminary faculty around the country, as well as a couple economists, and then there's a couple of pastors like me that are a part of thinking through how do we influence seminary education to more effectively form future pastors in wholeness and in pastoral effectiveness. And we're in San Diego for a retreat. It was a lovely time. But one of the most amazing things, again, you probably remember this, and we were talking back there about when we were there for a couple of rain like cats and dogs. At least that's what we call El Nino plus, but there was tornadoes or tornado warning or a sighting in San Diego. And I'm thinking, how does this work? This is Kansas. We have them out here. We have basements. We know what to do. So is that amazing? We were like, this is surreal. We come to San Diego for flowers and some sunshine and some warmer weather in January, because everything is gray. I mean, Kansas City is pretty temperate, actually. But it's gray in January. I mean, there's no flowers. The grass is gone. And so our trip to San Diego was greeted by a tornado. So we'll try to give you sunshine. We don't have an ocean, but it's beautiful today, isn't it? So thank you for being here. And I would like to open in prayer, not in a perfunctory way or pastoral way, but to say as we center our lives in Jesus today and recognize that the Spirit of God has to be our teacher. And so let's calm our hearts, as I mentioned yesterday. The history of the Christian church has a wonderful picture of morning and evening prayers. And the morning prayers were always a recognition that we are joining God in what He's already doing. He never sleeps as He watches over His world. So I always love that centering in my life, to greet the Lord in the morning, and also to affirm that God is very much at work when I am resting, right? And we join Him in that work. So let's just bow our hearts and heads as we pray, and we'll hopefully share some things that are important. We'll see. So Lord, we declare your loving kindness, your chesed in the morning, and your faithfulness at night. So it's a morning for us. We join you in the work you are doing and how you providentially put your care over us, Lord, as we have rested. Thank you, Lord, for our night of rest. Thank you for the goodness of this day. Thank you for what you are doing in the world and in our lives. Thank you for the city of San Diego, and Lord, what you are doing there. And I pray that these couple days might encourage my brothers and sisters to love in good deeds and to faithfulness. So Lord, again, we ask that you would give us wisdom, order our loves, help us to love rightly, to love you, to love your world, to love one another. And I do pray that you would give us the right thoughts and the insights that we need this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. I think I'm going to stand just to I don't know about you guys, I've had a really long week. It's a good week, but wow. And Fridays are usually my one day off. So I'm just saying, it's kind of my rhythm because we've been doing a lot of preaching and Easter and all this kind of stuff. So it's been a good time, but a really full time. Well, on a plane from Kansas City to Portland about a year ago, I sat on an aisle seat, which I usually do. And I'm an introvert. I'm a very deep introvert. And I'd already, given all my words that day that I had. And I usually don't engage people in conversation when I fly. I mean, maybe that's disappointing to you. I don't know. As a pastor, I'm supposed to always be gregarious and talking to people and saving souls. And I long to see Jesus save souls, believe me. But I sat by these two young men who are flying from Portland to Kansas City to visit their father, who's retired in the Ozarks of Missouri. And for some reason, outside of my normal patterns, I began to chat with them. I think I maybe even initiated it. And they told me again who they were. They were coming from Portland, and there were two brothers, and they were excited to see their dad. And I asked them what they did, what kind of work they did, and that sort of. And the younger brother, who was sitting by the window, began to talk to me. Sometimes as strangers, you almost are more transparent than people you know. It's kind of an odd paradox, isn't it? And so he said, well, it's not going very well. And I'm like, okay, well, tell me about this. Well, he'd explained he'd graduated from a good college a couple of years earlier. And he hadn't been able to find a good job. Yes, there were jobs, at Starbucks and things like that, but nothing could ever pay back his student loans. He needed a more robust job. I listened carefully, and you could just sense the burden, the struggle of his life. I have no idea of his faith journey at all. But I remember him saying to me, he said, it's really, really hard out there. I don't know what I'm going to do. It reminded me as a young boy, I remember my oldest brother, who's 10 years older than me. I remember the early years of my life listening to his really loud stereo. And on the stereo was a song that was the cry of a generation above me, ahead of me. And it was by Jackie DeShannon. And you know this song. It was a cry of a generation. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's the only thing there's just too little love. And I remember hearing that as a young boy, the cry of a generation. And that cry I still hear everywhere I go. I mean, the world still needs lots of love. But what I continually hear across the terrain of our culture, of diversity, of ethnicities, of age, is what the world needs now is jobs, sweet jobs. It's the only thing there's just too little of. I hear it in many ways that there's a deep, deep struggle with economic realities in our world. And I see it in many ways, I hear it in many ways. Let me just give you a couple of examples. As a pastor, you might think that my most frequent conversations with people are about the struggles in their relationships, marriage or singleness, which is true. I have a lot of conversations about that. I also have conversations about people's spiritual struggles, their doubts, their existential angst. I mean, that's not uncommon. But I have to say that my most common conversation with people is around economics. As a pastor, not too long ago after a Sunday morning worship service, one of my favorite sweet ladies, she's just adorable, bright woman. She's about 80 years of age, just as bright and sharp as a tack. And she's one of my favorite congregants in this particular campus that we're sitting in here today. And I gave the message, and she chatted with me at the door, which is not uncommon, right as people leave. And I said to her, how are you doing? I just had a moment. How are you doing? And I thought she would say to me, I'm doing great, or I'm not doing so good. But normally she's really positive. So I just said, how are you really doing? She said, well, I'm doing okay. She said, but I'm kind of, oh, would you pray for me? That's how she said. So I'm kind of, and she said, would you pray for me? And I said, well, about what? I thought she'd say her health. I mean, she's 80 years old, so as we say, the tent is getting a bit frayed. Or her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She's always showing me her pictures of all her family. I mean, she's a remarkable woman. And she said to me, basically, I'm concerned about running out of money. And she said, with historic low interest rates, you know how that's deeply impacted savers, right? She said, I'm not sure I'm going to have enough money for the length of my life. I mean, I'm going to run out of money. And I don't want to be a burden to my family. Isn't that amazing? Or I have a conversation, this is very common today, a conversation with parents who are seeing their children get to high school and then junior, senior year. And in my particular context, college really matters. It's a competitive thing, it's a family thing. There's a lot of that in this context of getting into a really good college. And they said to me, and this is not uncommon, this happens often, but recently they said the same thing. They said, you know, my daughter wants to get in this really good college, and it looks like she's going to get into this college, but we don't want her in a lot of debt, and it's very expensive. What are we going to do? And so they're asking these economic questions of wanting their children to go to college, a good college, but realizing that debt is not the answer, and the student debt issue, as you know, just in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, is massive in our culture. So what I want to suggest to all of us, wherever we are in our vocational placement, that we live every morning, we wake up every morning to an economic world. It's the world we live in. And perhaps like never before in human history, as far as we know, we live in a global economy that impacts our lives in powerful ways. The latest job reports, you know that, the housing starts, all that data is watched in nanosecond time around the globe. Janet Yellen, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, when she even twitches, the world moves. It's just amazing. And the economic headwinds and challenges are very, very extreme in many ways on a macroeconomic level in terms of globally. There's many, many pressures, not only nationally but globally. Also, we have rapid technological changes, and technology usually has, you know, a mixed bag, right? They're good, there's challenges, but technology inevitably means that work itself fundamentally changes in the human equation. Not too long ago, again, there was an article in The Atlantic. It's a magazine I read regularly. And the title was A World Without Work. And Derek Thompson makes this sort of prognostication about the fast growth of artificial intelligence and robotics. There's just an incredible amount of technological advance in that. And he says this will exert a slow but continual downward pressure on the value and availability of work. And he unpacks in this very lengthy, thoughtful article of what technology is doing to human work, both in its positives but in its negatives, in terms of how it's so deeply disruptive in different segments of society, manufacturing jobs, things like that are profoundly shaping the human family, and most of the displacement of male-female relationships. It's just amazing how technology profoundly shapes our culture, but work itself. So what will work look like in the future? Where will jobs come from? This is an increasing thinking, or what will economics be like in our world? Some of the most bright think tanks are dealing with that. And one of the things I hear more and more today is not just does my work matter, what I hear today, will there be work for me to do? How do I add value? Can I make a living wage? And you know all the struggles around minimum wage around the country, and the struggles, even I know a lot of press on California right now about that whole area. Okay, so people are asking the question, how do I make a living? I mean, that's not new, but it's very, very, very compelling across segments of society. Will there be money in my retirement? What about entitlements? I mean, there's just more and more kind of dynamics. The human need for security never ends. It never ends. So I want us to ask the question, as followers of Jesus, and particularly those who lead in a 501c3 world, are we missing something really important? Are we missing the important, sizable economic challenges? And are we hearing the contemporary cry of the world right now? What I hear over and over again is what the world needs now is jobs, sweet jobs. I hear incredible economic angst, fear, and hunger in this area of economic life. So I want to suggest that the Sunday to Monday gap between faith and our work, between our worship and the world, perhaps is much more massive than we imagine. I think it's much wider than we care to admit. And as you know, and if you've been a part of reading Work Matters, some of the early thinking of helping us have a rich theology of work is helping individuals like you and me understand our vertical stewardship, right? to honor the gifts we've been given and to be a good steward of our own work. The book Work Matters was focused primarily, except for the very last chapter that I wrote, on individual stewardship of our work, and that matters. But the biblical story does not just talk about me and my work and faithfulness in my work, but how my work intersects with others. That work is not just fundamentally individual contribution to God's good world, but it's also mutual collaboration because we are created with community in mind. So the gospel speaks into every nook and cranny of life, but how does the Christian faith inform our thinking, our prayers, and our priorities when it comes to our global economy? And how does it inform economic opportunity for others? My work matters, yes, not only to God, but it matters deeply to my neighbor in the world. So is it possible, and these are questions I'm wrestling with, is it possible that our lack of thought and engagement in the economic challenges of our day, which are massive, is it possible we have a very impoverished understanding of our implication in that? And is it because, at least at some level, we have an impoverished understanding of Jesus' perhaps most powerful teaching on the Great Commandment? So I'd like to begin our conversation on the importance of economics, and I'd like us to look at Jesus' most powerful teaching on the Great Commandment. And I want to just suggest for your consideration this morning, could we be overlooking something very, very important? Jesus taught us to love God and love our neighbor, and he said that is at the very heart of the Christian faith. We know that he summarized the whole Testament. The Old Testament is in a threefold progression of Torah, the instruction, right? The Torah, then on top of that is the Navaim, the prophets, and the Kataim, the writings. He summarized the whole Testament, halakha, the way, the halakha of Sadiq, the righteous way, the way of God in the Great Commandment. He summarizes it. Brilliant, Jesus does. So we know it's very important, but what does loving God and loving our neighbor mean? What does it mean? Does it mean loving our neighbor in the sense of taking them soup when they're sick? It's a good thing. Does it mean mowing their lawn when they're on vacation? Yes, that's a good thing. But what if Jesus had much, much more in mind when he told us that God's will for our lives as image bearers in redemption, ultimately in consummation, is to love God and love our neighbor in a seamless way? What if he had much more in mind than that? I really believe he does, and I think that the Great Commandment speaks to the collaborative work we are called to do every day in our modern world. And what if neighborly love fuels the economic flourishing not only of our local neighbor, not only of our city neighbor, but our global neighbor? I think that's a really, really important question. What if? What if true neighborly love fuels the economic flourishing of our world? What if? And I'd like us to take a closer look at the Gospels. And I want to suggest that Jesus spoke powerfully about economic life. We know he spoke a lot about money and work and economics in the first century, more than we can ever imagine. One of my friends, who's a wonderful New Testament scholar, Dr. Klaus Isler, he's at Talbot actually, has been doing a lot of work lately on the parables of Jesus. And one of the things that Klaus Isler says over and over again in his research is 37 parables Jesus taught. Think of this, 32 of them have a strong thread of work and economic life in them. That's stunning. I mean, it shouldn't surprise us, though, if we understand a good Christology, should it? Because Jesus spent the vast majority of his life on this sin-ravaged planet being a carpenter, making things, running a small business, the vast majority, and that has incredible implications for what we're about. But it shouldn't surprise us that Jesus' stories are embedded in his vocational world as a carpenter, right? And the economic life of the first century. So I'm just going to ask the question. I want you to think this. I don't know if you've had economics but what if Jesus in his own way points back to that economic textbook we had in high school or college? Is it possible? What if the Bible has a lot to say about human flourishing, and particularly the aspect of economic flourishing within human flourishing? What if neighborly love is much, much more important, much more comprehensive than many of us have ever imagined? If you have a Bible, you may have a Bible with you. I'm going to open the text this morning, electronic or paper, or just listen along. But I want us to look more carefully at Luke chapter 10, because our conversation around economic life and economic flourishing from a theological standpoint does not begin here. It begins obviously in Genesis 1 and 2 and fruitfulness and collaboration. We're not going to unpack Genesis 1 and 2 of the economic foundation, but I want us to focus more on Jesus' teaching. Because Jesus, in the great Jewish tradition, the biblical tradition, profoundly gives a brilliant midrashic commentary on Torah in this text. So instead of going to creation, I'm going to go to Jesus' teaching this morning. And in verses 25, Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37, the literary structure of this text is framed in two ways. First, around a revealing conversation and then a riveting story. And Jesus brings these together. Luke, in his brilliant, perhaps he has the most brilliant artistry of Greek in the New Testament, brilliantly brings these two together. And so there's this revealing conversation that sets up a riveting story. So let's first look at the revealing conversation. In verses 25 to 29, if you have it in front of you, and I'm going to just read it for us since we have the time today. This is God's word. And behold, a lawyer stood up, or a scribe, an expert in Torah, or Old Testament, stood up to put him to the test, saying, Teacher, or Rabbi, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Now notice he doesn't say first and second commandment here, okay? It's a seamlessness. And he said to him, You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. So when you engage in this conversation, the expert asked Jesus how one inherits eternal life. This is important in the way of righteousness, the tzaddik, the righteous way, right? This fits rabbinical conversation. Very important in the Old Testament. And don't you love it? And this is good for pastors and teachers. Rather than giving an answer, Jesus asks him back a question. Brilliant Jesus. I mean, Jesus, as Dallas was, is the most brilliant being in the universe. I mean, we often forget how brilliant Jesus is in every aspect. He should be brilliant because he's the Son of God, right? But he asked him, what does the Old Testament say about that? I'm translating it a little bit. What does the Old Testament say? You're the expert. What does it say? Right? Puts him back on his heels. And so, again, he quotes Leviticus 19:18 and Deuteronomy 6:5. I mean, he knows his Torah, this guy. Smart guy. And Jesus affirms this guy's insight, doesn't he? He doesn't add it. He just says, okay, go live it. You would think that would be the end of the conversation, right? Not only from a literary standpoint, but from a logical standpoint. That's it. You got it. Go for it. But there's some twists. Now, remember, Luke gives us little insight. Over and over again, the heart of the matter is the matter of the heart against the legal and Pharisaical people. I mean, Jesus is constantly going to the heart, isn't he? The heart. You got the externals, but the heart. So Luke gives us a hint. Remember, Luke is more Gentile. He's speaking to the world. He wants to make sure we don't miss what's really going on here. So this is an argument over text. It's an issue of the heart. So we see here that the language is he's putting Jesus to test. So it shows a motivation twist. And we are to understand as a reader that this self-righteous guy has a heart problem more than just a head problem. He wants to have merit of the righteous life on his own goodness. And so there's this massive gap between what he read in the Torah and how he lived. But the heart of the issue was a wrongful love. So I would suggest, and again, we don't know this exactly, and I don't want to be, but I think his response is a prideful perturbedness in my mind. He's pridefully kind of perturbed. That's how I would say it. And this guy comes back to Jesus and says, okay, who's my neighbor? Now, rather than giving him a bad answer, I love this, Jesus tells him a powerful story. And this is good pedagogy. This is good wisdom for all of us who lead or serve. And the story answers not only a question, this is what's important. It not only answers the question, who is my neighbor, that the guy asked. Jesus answers an even more important question that is at the heart of the matter. And the question is, how do I love my neighbor? Who is my neighbor, and how do I love my neighbor? Okay, now he tells a riveting story. We know this story, right? Or do we? Let's begin in verse 30. I'm not going to read it all. I'm going to retell it a little bit. Okay? And you can read it carefully. But beginning in verse 30, Jesus tells of a man who, notice, is going down to Jericho. It's a 17-mile trek. I've done it. It's the Wadi Kilt. It's a famous area. We know almost exactly where it is from history. It's the old Jericho road that follows wadis, a certain wadi. Culturally, the guy that's going from Jerusalem to Jericho, going down in geography, right, is almost certainly a Jewish man. And along the way, and there are places along the Wadi Kilt that are very conducive for robbery. Okay, and again, if you walked it, hiked it, there are certain areas that are strategic places where if you want to rob someone on the road, think of the rest stop, think of the highway in modern times, this is where you hang out. And notice the text begins with the brazen injustice of thugs who rob and beat this Jewish man and leave him to die. So as Jesus tells the story, first one that encounters this man who's been robbed, beaten, and left for dead is a Jewish priest. He's making his way to Jericho, it seems, by the story. And he comes to this guy and he walks by. There's all kinds of potential rationalizations why he does, because of uncleanliness or whatever. Okay. Right after it, there's a Levite that comes by. So you have a priest and a Levite, and they do the same thing. They walk by. They see him and walk by. Then a Samaritan comes walking by. Now, culturally, most likely this Samaritan is not a Samaritan priest. Or Jesus would have specifically said this. I mean, again, we're talking high level of confidence here, not certainty, which none of us really have. High confidence that Jesus intentionally not only places a Samaritan, but a Samaritan business person here. Because Jericho, even from Neolithic ages, 8,000 BC, Madame Kenyon, a British great archaeologist, uncovered 8,000 BC, Jericho was a hub of commercial activity. Think back to Joshua without me being improper. Think why Rahab had such a vital business. Okay? I mean, Jericho is an important place as it connects the spice trade, where it's located. So Jericho was a place of economic vitality across ancient times, and certainly the first century. So Jesus clearly knew that, understood that, had spent time there, and so his story is centered in this. So he's making his way down to Jericho, most likely to do business. And we know that racially, right, and religiously, the Samaritans were looked down by the Jews. We know that at that time, that was very much a part of the cultural challenges of the day. Unlike the priest and the Levite, the Samaritan business has compassion on this guy. And the Samaritan crosses lines of racial bigotry and religious prejudice. You see that he offers first aid. But not only that, he interrupts his entire business trip and takes this guy to an inn so he can recover. And we know, right, that the surprising hero of the story is not the Jewish Levite or priest. It is the Samaritan business guy. Now, there's a riveting contrast Jesus presents to us in this story. The contrast of religious bigotry and hypocrisy of this Levite and priest with the Christ-like compassion of the Samaritan businessman. We know that. The Levite, priest, and Samaritan all saw the man who had been robbed. They all saw him beaten and left dead by the road. They all knew the Torah of what it meant to love your neighbor, to have compassion on the wounded and hurting. But only the Samaritan saw this beaten man as God sees him, as a neighbor in need. Now, in the story, Jesus employs a very important word, and the story pivots on this Greek word. This Greek word is found in verse 33. It's the unusual word. It's translated compassion or pity, depending on your translation. It's a very unusual word. Matthew uses it just 3 or 4 times. Luke uses it only 3. It's not the common word elios for mercy or pity. It's a very unique and unusual word. And it's really important for us to grasp what Jesus is doing here. It is the sense of a visceral feeling of identification with someone else. It's not just caring for someone, it has physiological implications of your emotion. It's used often of kidneys or entrails. It is literally if you've ever been in a situation where you're emotionally so distraught you throw up, right? You have a physiological reaction, a viscera, okay? So this word is used by Luke 3 times. And it's used each time in an economic context. Its most notable usage is just down the road in Luke 15, in the parable of the prodigal sons. You remember the story. In Luke chapter 15, the father sees his son, his prodigal son. I mean, in one sense, they're both prodigals. But he sees his son from a distance. Now remember, his son does the unthinkable in shaming the family, takes all his economic inheritance, squanders it all, right? But yet comes back to his father. Does the unthinkable in every dimension, family, shame, economic, foolishness, all of it there. He does the unimaginable, right? And he comes back, and his father's looking, watching for him. And when his father sees him, remember, this boy is spiritually, economically, every way completely bankrupt. When his father sees him coming down the road, he has this word. Okay? It's splagnathon. It's a very hard word to say in Greek. But he feels such empathy and generous love for him. So Luke is connecting these two stories with this word. And the loving Samaritan, he is saying, is unlike the 2 religious leaders. The Samaritan businessman saw the robbed man beaten, of course, and left for dead by the road, not as a Jew or Samaritan, but as he would see his own desperately needy son. Because woven into this word for compassion is this deep familial love that stems from a Hebrew word called rechem, or rechemim, which is womb. It's the most tender love of a parent for a child. This familial love is what the Samaritan had for the Jewish man beaten and left dead by the road. Okay? It is a love of empathy and action for someone who is a stranger yet treated like the member of your own family. So here's the idea. Jesus is raising the bar. He does that a lot, doesn't he? And what he's saying is that neighborly love is merely an extension of familial love, the family of humanity. And Jesus is very explicit that the Samaritan does even more in his story, more than you would ever imagine or expect, even in Torah. He offers first aid, which is expectation. But like the generous father in the parable of the prodigal son, he does even more than offer first aid. The father in Luke 15 does the most amazing generosity. He puts a ring on his son's finger. You remember that? Shoes on his feet. The generous Samaritan businessman pulls out his Visa card. That's it. And he guarantees payment for whatever the robbed and injured man will need in this crisis. And if you follow the amount of exchange to the innkeeper, it's a lot of money. So in Jesus' story, there is a riveting contrast between the callousness of the religious leaders and the compassion of this businessman. But what we often miss is there's another riveting contrast. We often miss this. The contrast is set between the economic injustice of the robbers and the economic generosity and capacity of the Samaritan businessman. Embedded in the parable is this riveting contrast between the economic injustice of the robbers who wrongly take what is not theirs and the economic goodness of the Good Samaritan who's generously giving what is rightfully his. Now, Kenneth Bailey, I think, is the finest cultural scholar of the Gospels, Middle Eastern scholar on cultural understanding here. And he says that this parable has 7 scenes, and they are framed with a resource contrast. That's what he says. In scene 1, the robbers take all the man's possessions, and in scene 7, this is called the inclusio, a bookend, literary bookend. It's my ad. The Samaritan pays for the man out of his own resources because the man has nothing. Dr. Bailey is onto something very important in how this is set up. That loving our neighbor in need, Jesus says, involves both Christian compassion, but also capacity. Jesus goes out of his way in the story to describe not only this merciful compassion of the Samaritan, but also the extraordinary economic generosity of the Samaritan. And the question is, how is the Samaritan able to care for his neighbor in the moment of crisis? How is he able to help his neighbor get back on his feet? And the Samaritan, again, not only has the right heartfelt compassion, but he has the economic capacity. Where did that economic capacity come from? This value add to help his needy neighbor. See, economic capacity in that century and in ours comes from diligent labor and financial stewardship within the economic system of adding value to others. That's how it happens. And see, the gospel empowers us to have neighborly love, doesn't it? The gospel transforms not only our work, but also our economic life. Rabbi Paul, who becomes the Apostle Paul, I think, giving you my opinion, is giving a bit of a midrashic commentary on this story in Ephesians chapter 4. In Ephesians chapter 4:28, Paul, in this brilliant treatise of the gospel and its transformation in all of life, says this. Now listen carefully. Ephesians 4:28. I want you to hear Jesus' teaching on the Good Samaritan. Here's what Paul says. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands. Now here's your inferential conjunction. Logical. So that. Very explicit in the Greek. So that he may have something to share with anyone in need. Let me say that again. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. So do we grasp what Paul is saying? The gospel not only addresses our greatest impoverishment, which is clearly spiritual impoverishment, relational impoverishment, and Brian Fickert has brilliantly articulated that in his work. But the gospel also presses into economic realities and economic impoverishment in powerful ways. Right? The gospel compels us to live in such a God-honoring way that we do honest work, make an honest profit, cultivate economic capacity so that we can serve others with their economic needs. That's what Jesus is saying. This is only who our neighbor is, but how do we love them? Martin Luther, again, the great Protestant reformer in the 16th century, said this, and Luther had so much right on this area of vocation. He says, God does not need your good work, but your neighbor does. See, a primary way we love our neighbors is, of course, to do our work well. I think we all grab that. But from our work, to have the capacity to be generous to our neighbors in need. And what I think Jesus is saying, in a sense, is the best workers make the best neighbors. The best workers make the best neighbors. Because the best workers not only are called to have the compassion, but the capacity to love their neighbor. And we can say capacity of value and influence of time, but clearly of economic exchange. So how can we be generous in caring for our neighbor, whether it's local or global, if we have nothing to be generous with? Right? We're all called to be generous with our time, talent, and treasure. Jesus is more blessed to give than receive. Remember, that's the quote Paul says to the Ephesian elders, which is all about hard work and economic realities in Acts 20. It's all about that. Final words to the Ephesian elders is about economics and generosity. Isn't that interesting? See, we're called to be generous in sharing the gospel, of course, in the workplace, with our neighbors. We're also called to be generous with our financial resources. And they come from diligent labor and wise financial management. Capacity matters. Capacity doesn't just happen out of the blue. It's cultivated, it's nourished, it's directed, it's harnessed. And I want to suggest that the Great Commandment challenges us to better connect Sunday to Monday. Not only by nurturing compassionate hearts, it's got to be there first, right? To see others, our neighbor, local, global, through the eyes of Jesus as our brother and sister in need, right? That familial love. But also, we need to nourish economic capacity. So how do we narrow the Sunday to Monday gap between faith work and economic flourishing of our neighbors? I think that's a really big question for us to think through individually and as institutions and as churches and as organizations. How do we do this? The gospel calls us to do this. Jesus is saying not only who our neighbor is, but how do we love them? And how we love them is not just merely having compassion for them, it's also adding our value add capacity to help them or to be involved in. And that's the economy in the broadest sense. Yes, it's the allocation of scarce resources, technical definition of economics. But it's adding value to others, time, talent, treasure, influence. But our primary way in a global world, as even the first century world, is through economic exchange. So economics matters. So how do I love my neighbor? How do I love my neighbor? That's a really good question. First of all, I think we need to know our neighbor. Who's our neighbor? Who's our neighbor in our global world? Our neighbor is not only who we work with and those who are proximate to us. Our neighbor are those people who society says are not our neighbor. Just like first century Jewish society, that Samaritans were not their neighbor, right? Proximity calls for responsibility. It implicates us in a globalized world. And there's not just geographical proximity, there's human proximity. And for many of us, or at least for me, there's an incredible danger of cultural insularity and isolation. Liz and I, my bride Liz and I, a year ago, walked, we didn't just drive through, we walked for 45 minutes down Prospect Avenue in Kansas City. We're deeply committed to this city. But we have our own cultural insularity and isolation. We work with our city. We love our city. We work with all kinds of partners, but it's one of the most desperate stretches of our city imaginable in Kansas City. When's the last time you've walked in the most desperate, spiritual, moral, relational, economic, blighted area of your city? Walked it, smelled it, felt it. And we walked that, again, it just ripped our hearts open. What does it mean when we saw such desperation on all levels of impoverishment? Not only a food desert, not only bars in front of windows. I mean, it's just amazing walking down when there's such economic devastation and moral devastation and personal devastation. Have you felt it? Have you smelled it? Have you touched it? One business was open, if you want to call it that. A small little store that sold alcohol and cigarettes, a food desert with high prices and a payday loan agency. People standing around, right? Even suspicious as we walked through the neighborhood. But we need to know our neighbor deeply and to see them deeply and to understand that we're implicated in that and we have some responsibility. But it's not just having compassion, it's how do we nourish capacity? How do we nourish capacity? So how do we help our neighbor? When you think about helping your neighbor, we need to think first about our work and how work creates value, how it brings economic capacity, not only for providing for us, but coming alongside the poor and the under-resourced. How do we do this? See, both the generation of wealth and stewardship, of economic capacity through diligent work, needs biblical love and wisdom to guide it, doesn't it? You cannot help your neighbor well if you don't understand economics well. Say that again. You and I can't really help our neighbor well if we don't understand economics well. We live in an economic world. We are tied together through economic life. Human flourishing and economic flourishing go hand in hand. So how are we addressing this? We need to do our work well, of course. And let's not miss in the story that the Samaritan incarnated neighborly love, but so did the innkeeper. Did you notice the innkeeper in the story? The innkeeper was someone who provided a service to their business every day, right? And unlike the thugs of economic injustice, the robbed Jewish man, the innkeeper worked hard and he maintained a helpful business to serve others every day. Neighborly love is more about how you and I work than where we live. Because the best workers can make the best neighbors. Not only of compassion, but of capacity. Work is never a solitary enterprise. It's woven into the fabric of human community. We see this all over our world. Tim is a modern-day Samaritan businessman to me. He's a part of this particular campus. He understands his work not only as an individual stewardship, but a collective collaboration for the good of the world. He understands when he goes to work every day that his work not only matters to God, it's not only an act of worship, It's not only a place of gospel plausibility and gospel proclamation, it is a place of loving his neighbor, both locally and globally. He sent me this email not too long ago. He's been working with a talented workforce in India the last 15 years. His corporation he serves is organized here, but they serve the whole world. And this is what he says: what I've come to realize is that my position of influence, notice that economic language, that economics is, yes, monetary change is also influence and access and value, okay? So he says, I've noticed that my position of influence puts me in a unique position as a Christian. He says, my workers in India are hardworking, college-educated, and have a desire to live a good life. I pay a fair wage and offer a path to economic freedom and advancement for many in this nation. Many on the team are first generations, and they're the first generation to graduate from college. They're mostly Hindu and Muslim. During my many visits to India, they've told me that my values seem different from the perceptions they've had of so many Americans. I've been able to share my faith and values with a group that is willing to listen. He goes on to talk more about that. He says their prosperity trickles down in their communities, and hopefully they see a little of the love of Jesus reflected through me. Here's a corporate business leader centered out of Kansas City, working across the globe, as all economics is all both local and global today. We live in a flattened world, don't we? And he's beginning to understand how his faith of loving his neighbor not only is involved loving God and doing his work well, but understanding its collaborative responsibility and opportunity to love the world through his work. Economics matters. It matters more than we ever imagined. And we must not miss that the Samaritan businessman not only loved his neighbor with his financial generosity, he risked his life for his neighbor. There's more in this story we miss. The hatred and bigotry in the first century and prejudice of this time was unbelievable. So for this Samaritan business person to take this wounded Jewish man to an inn, he would have faced a very hostile reception. Kenneth Bailey, again, this cultural scholar, puts it in an American context around 1850. It's kind of humorous. He says, suppose a Native American found a cowboy with 2 arrows in his back, placed the cowboy on his horse, and rode into Dodge City. What kind of reception do you think he would receive? And I think we can understand that in all of Jesus' brilliant layering of the story, the 2 riveting contrasts, the central themes of compassion and capacity of loving our neighbor, Jesus is really pointing to himself, isn't he? Jesus is ultimately the loving Samaritan. He would not only risk his life, but lay it down on the cross for you and me, because we are all that person left and beaten by the road. We need that fatherly love, that compassion, don't we? And we need the sacrifice and his capacity that met our need. We are utterly hopeless and without hope, like the guy beaten by the road. And Jesus, again, had both the compassion. This is particularly pregnant, I think, right now during just after Lenten season and Holy Week. And he had the capacity to rescue us and the commitment to do that. So what I want to suggest is Jesus is the one true good neighbor, and he demonstrates his faithful work not only in the carpentry shop, but also his sacrificial atoning death on the cross. What I want to suggest for our consideration, I'll open it up for some questions and comment. What does this mean for us? The world is crying out for economic flourishing, wrestling with economic injustice, isn't it? Economic life. In an amazing time where the church is increasingly marginalized, where the plausibility of the gospel is increasingly questioned. And yet the world is crying out, with what we need now is jobs, sweet jobs. We need economic flourishing, right? And what is the church doing? The world always needs love, sweet love. And Jesus is the ultimate lover of our souls. We point it to him. But the world also needs jobs. It needs economic vitality. And the world is crying out for that. And what are we doing? What's our response? Are we committed to not only nourish Christ-like compassion, but also work to nourish and expand capacity? That means many things, right? Just like entrepreneurship, addressing issues of systemic injustice economically, policy. Raj Chetty, one of the finest economists at Harvard, in a Wall Street Journal article not too long ago, described the greatest need. I don't think he's a believer. I don't know any of his worldview. And he said the greatest need in many of our communities are vibrant local schools and vibrant local churches, church communities, right? Because education, church, are the ideas of human flourishing that lead to economic vitality and well-being. How are we addressing this? Where are the opportunities for entrepreneurship, for job training, to affirm human dignity, to address systemic issues? I'm just saying that Jesus' teaching on the Great Commandment compels us to think not only about our compassion, but how are we nourishing capacity? And I think this has great implications for us right now at our time. So we can begin, let's have some conversation. We can begin to think, what does it mean to love our neighbor? Not only in nourishing compassion to our neighbor, but what does it mean to help expand capacity, wealth creation, human dignity, innovation, creativity in a world that's changing, and work itself is changing. What the world needs now is jobs, sweet jobs. It needs economic vitality. It needs human opportunity in ways we never even imagined technologically. So how are we responding? So I'm saying that work matters. It matters to God. Your work matters. My work matters. But it also matters to our neighbor and to our global economy and to human flourishing. And it is, I think, one of the most amazing opportunities for the gospel in our time. Because I see the church so marginalized in so many ways. And Raj Chetty's right. For economic well-being, community churches have a vital role. Not only schools and government policy, but local churches. I'm stunned, but I've never met Raj Chetty, but that stuns me. Okay, so I'm going to stop there.